Serafina held on to her old suitcase, feeling excited but nervous. She had never flown first class before, and now she was about to. Her aunt, who had taken care of her after her parents passed away, was sick. A faraway cousin paid for her flight so she could go visit her. When Serafina got to the airport, she handed the ticket to the worker at the counter. She thought she'd be sitting in the back of the plane, like always, but the worker said there weren't enough seats in economy and upgraded her to first class. Serafina couldn't believe it. She was both happy and nervous about flying in a fancy section of the plane. She went through security, feeling a little worried about what the people in first class would be like. Would they think she didn't belong? She took a deep breath, remembering her aunt, and walked to the right gate. She got in line with other people who wore fancy clothes, while feeling a bit self-conscious. When it was time to get on the plane, she saw that her seat was near the front, row 2. She had never been that close before. She smiled politely at the flight attendants and walked onto the plane, where they showed her to her seat. The first-class cabin was so different from economy. It felt calm, and the seats were big and comfortable. The soft light in the cabin made everything feel warm and relaxing. Serafina couldn't believe she was actually sitting there. The man sitting next to her, wearing a nice navy suit, smiled at her and showed her how to use the seat controls. His name was Thaddeus. He was kind and helped her feel more comfortable. When the flight attendants came by with drinks before takeoff, Serafina nervously chose sparkling water, trying not to look too overwhelmed. As the plane started to go up, Serafina felt her heart race with excitement. The engines roared and she sank into her seat. After a little while, the seatbelt sign went off and she tried to make herself comfortable. Suddenly, the plane shook and Serafina gripped the armrests tightly. Thaddeus noticed and gave her a bottle of water. He spoke in a calm voice and said, "Don't worry. This happens sometimes. It'll pass soon." For a moment, the turbulence got worse and the plane shook even harder. The lights flickered and people gasped. Serafina felt scared, but Thaddeus kept calm. He placed his hand on the armrest between them as if to comfort her, and it helped. Flight attendants walked around, making sure everyone was okay. Thaddeus tried to make Serafina laugh by joking about the turbulence. And even though she was still nervous, she smiled a little. Then, a man across the aisle started yelling, saying the plane was too unstable. His voice was loud and scared. Thaddeus stood up, calm but firm, and told the man to sit down for his safety. After that, Serafina gently offered the man a bottle of water. He looked surprised and a bit embarrassed, but took the water. Soon, the flight attendants helped him back to his seat, and the mood in the cabin started to relax. As the plane went higher, the turbulence finally stopped. Serafina felt her heart slow down, and she was grateful for Thaddeus's help. The plane flew smoothly now, and everyone seemed to settle down. Thaddeus smiled at her again, and she felt more comfortable. A flight attendant came by and said they would serve lunch soon. Thaddeus's phone buzzed, and he quickly answered it. Serafina noticed he seemed serious all of a sudden. She couldn't hear everything he said, but it sounded important. He said something about a business deal with someone from the Middle East and that he would take care of it when they landed. Serafina was curious but didn't want to ask him too much. After a little while, Thaddeus came back to his seat, looking calm again. He apologized for the phone call and said it was about business. Serafina nodded, not sure if she should ask more. They both stayed quiet for a moment, and then the plane shook again. The seatbelt sign came on, and people started to get nervous again. But Thaddeus spoke to Serafina in a soft voice, saying, "It's okay. It's normal for this part of the flight. Just let me know if you need anything to distract you." Serafina nodded, feeling comforted. Thaddeus placed a blanket over her lap to help her feel cozy. She smiled and said, "It's strange. I usually fly in economy, and it's so cramped. I've never had turbulence like this before." Thaddeus smiled back and said, "It's the weather. Sometimes it's unpredictable over the ocean." Serafina decided to share a little about herself to distract herself from the shaking plane. "I'm going to see my aunt. She's not feeling well. She needs constant care, so I'm going to help her. We're the only family we have left, so it's just the two of us." Thaddeus listened and looked thoughtful. "I hope she gets better soon. Family is really important," he said kindly. Then the plane shook again, a bit more roughly. Serafina grabbed the armrest, her heart racing again. People started to whisper, and one of the flight attendants came by with towels, just in case people needed to wipe away sweat or spills. Thaddeus gave her a reassuring look, and soon everyone was settling back into their seats. The turbulence had scared some people, but Thaddeus's calmness helped Serafina feel better. At last, after the turbulence stopped, Serafina felt like she could breathe again. She was starting to feel safe and calm with Thaddeus sitting beside her. Just then, another shake of the plane made the seatbelt sign light up again. Thaddeus leaned closer to Serafina and said, "Take slow breaths. It'll be over soon." Serafina nodded, feeling comforted by his presence. She leaned back in her seat, the blanket over her lap, and let herself relax. Thaddeus looked around the room, noticing everything happening around him. The plane shook, but he stayed calm. "This kind of turbulence can't always be predicted," he said, trying to comfort the passengers. "The crew is doing their best to keep everyone safe." His voice was steady, and even though the plane was rocking, he sounded in control. A passenger who was upset shouted about the airline not doing their job right. He looked scared and sweaty, and he kept asking if something was wrong with the engine. Serafina felt worried too, but she quickly grabbed a water bottle from the seat pocket in front of her and walked over to him. "Here," she said gently, "you should sit down before you get hurt." The man looked surprised, his anger calming down a little because of her kind voice. Thaddeus saw the chance to help and gently touched the man's arm. "You can be upset, but you need to stay safe," he said. The flight attendant came over and spoke in a soothing voice. Slowly, the man agreed to sit back down. The plane quieted down with only the sound of the plane's engine and air vents. Serafina took a deep breath, still feeling her heart beat fast. She felt Thaddeus next to her, his presence comforting her. The flight attendant quietly thanked them both for helping and went back to her work. As the turbulence stopped, Thaddeus helped Serafina sit back in her seat, and everyone started to feel more relaxed. The lights in the cabin became steady again, and people started taking off their seatbelts. The passengers began talking quietly to each other, feeling relieved. "Thank you," Serafina said to Thaddeus, smiling a little. "You were so calm, I think everyone else was too shocked to speak." Thaddeus shrugged, looking humble. "I've dealt with tense situations before, though not usually in a plane," he said. Serafina wondered what he meant by that, but she could tell he didn't want to talk about it. He looked at her with a small smile. "Are you feeling better now?" he asked, noticing her pale face. "Yeah," she replied, feeling surprised. "I think I trust your instincts up here." They talked more about the places they had been and the things they'd done. Serafina shared some details about her life, like her small apartment and her aunt who was sick. Thaddeus listened closely, giving her kind words. But sometimes she saw a look in his eyes, like he was dealing with bigger problems than just a flight or a visit to the hospital. He didn't say much about himself, and she could tell he was keeping something private. Time passed, and the plane ride became peaceful. As they talked, Serafina began to feel braver. Maybe it was the high altitude or the feeling that they were in their own little world. She wanted to ask him more about his job and why he always seemed to get urgent phone messages. But before she could, the pilot's voice came over the intercom, saying they were getting closer to their destination. Thaddeus looked at his phone again, his face serious. He glanced at her, and Serafina knew that her question would have to wait. When the plane landed, Serafina felt a little jolt. She was glad it was over. The lights in the cabin went out, and people started getting up. Thaddeus looked at his phone again, looking worried, and Serafina knew he had to leave soon. As they walked out of the plane, he turned to her. "I guess this is where we part ways," he said, his voice a little sad. Serafina smiled, though she felt a knot in her stomach. "Yeah, I guess so," she said, brushing her hair behind her ear. They walked down the jet bridge together, with lots of other travelers rushing by. Thaddeus checked his phone again, looking even more worried. "I'm about to be late," he said, "but I don't want to leave without making sure we can stay in touch." Serafina's heart skipped a beat. "Really?" she asked. Thaddeus took a business card out of his pocket, but then he hesitated, as if not wanting to share too much. Instead, he scribbled something on the back of the card and handed it to her. "This is me," he said. "I'd like to hear from you. Maybe we can meet again after you settle with your aunt." Serafina felt a flutter in her chest. "Thank you," she said quietly, tucking the card into her purse. She was about to type his number into her phone, but was distracted by the crowd around her. She finally found a quiet spot, pulled out her phone, and typed the number in. As she pressed the call button, she felt nervous. Would he answer? She heard the phone ring, but no one picked up. She felt disappointed, but reminded herself he might be busy. She decided not to worry and took another sip of her coffee. Later that evening, Serafina was at the hospital with her aunt. After making sure her aunt was comfortable, she sat down beside her. Her aunt looked at her closely and smiled. "You look different," she said. "Did you meet someone on the flight?" Serafina blushed, but she smiled and changed the subject. "Let's get you comfortable first," she said. Later that night, Serafina went to the cafeteria and drank coffee, thinking about Thaddeus. She looked at the card again, checking the number. She felt unsure if she had written it down correctly, but she pressed the call button anyway. The phone rang, but no one picked up again. She sighed and decided not to worry about it, but the thought of Thaddeus stayed with her. Eventually, she left the cafeteria and went back to her aunt's room. When she came back, her aunt woke up a little and smiled. "I have a feeling everything will be okay," her aunt whispered as Serafina tucked the blankets around her. "And with whatever is going on in your heart, everything will be okay." Serafina felt a lump form in her throat, and tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. She nodded in response, her lips pressed together in a silent promise to keep the hope alive, despite the uncertainty that lingered in her heart. The stillness of the hospital room surrounded them, and Serafina attempted once more to call Thaddeus. This time, she held her breath, half expecting to hear his familiar voice on the other end of the line. Instead, she was met with the cold, pre-recorded message that said, "The number you are trying to reach is unavailable." The call ended, and Serafina's heart sank, heavy with the realization that perhaps she had lost her chance to reconnect with him. A few days passed, and the emptiness of the situation began to weigh heavily on Serafina. She tried calling Thaddeus again, but each attempt resulted in the same disheartening outcome: voicemail. Had she dialed the wrong number? She wondered if there had been a mistake when he gave it to her. Or perhaps her hope was in vain, and Thaddeus had intentionally distanced himself, vanishing from her life as quickly as he had entered it. The weeks dragged on in a quiet, repetitive rhythm. Serafina had settled into a daily routine at her aunt's small house, making sure her aunt received the care and attention she needed. Every morning, she woke up early, prepared breakfast, and tidied the cozy living room. Afterward, she would rush out to run errands, picking up groceries and medications. Day by day, her aunt's health steadily improved, and the pallor that had once drained the color from her cheeks slowly receded, replaced by a soft glow of hope. But despite this, Serafina felt the weight of something else, an unfamiliar sense of unease that seemed to be creeping in from the edges of her life. It all began subtly, one morning as she cracked eggs into a pan. The smell, once pleasant, suddenly made her stomach churn. She stepped back, feeling queasy, and opened the window to get some fresh air, thinking it was nothing more than the fatigue from too many sleepless nights. But the nausea returned, and this time it was accompanied by dizziness. She found herself losing her appetite, skipping meals without intending to. It became harder and harder to ignore, yet she tried to brush it off as nothing serious. Her aunt noticed one afternoon when Serafina was massaging her aunt's hands, easing the stiffness in her joints. The older woman looked at her critically and asked, "You haven't been finishing your food. That's not like you." Her voice was gentle but firm, the tone of someone who had known Serafina her entire life. Serafina gave a shaky smile and quickly explained, "I think it's just the stress and the traveling. It will catch up with anyone eventually." She tried to convince her aunt, but part of her knew something was wrong. It wasn't just the stress, there was more to it. She thought about Thaddeus and how she hadn't heard from him in so long. He hadn't answered her calls or returned her messages. The last time she had spoken to him, she had only caught fragments of his conversation about business deals and investors. Desperation set in as she spent hours searching online, hoping to find any clue about him, but nothing concrete came up. It was as if he had vanished from the face of the earth, and with each unanswered attempt to reach him, the disappointment and frustration inside her grew. Serafina pushed herself forward, focusing on her aunt's recovery. Her aunt was getting better, and that at least gave her some peace of mind, but Serafina couldn't shake the feeling of worry that gnawed at her. Then, a few days later, the queasiness became too much to ignore. She found herself leaning over the bathroom sink before dawn, feeling sick to her stomach. The severity of it alarmed her enough that she decided to go to the doctor. "I'm sure it's just the flu," she told her aunt, attempting to reassure both of them as she wrapped a scarf around her neck. Her aunt frowned in concern, but agreed to let her go. Serafina walked the few blocks to the small clinic in the neighborhood, still unsure about what was happening to her body. The clinic was quiet when she arrived. She sat in the waiting room, surrounded by other patients, an elderly man with a cough, a mother comforting her child. She tried to distract herself by flipping through an old magazine, but her mind kept returning to the strange sensations in her body. Finally, the doctor called her in. He was a kind, middle-aged man with a calm manner. After listening to her symptoms, nausea, dizziness, and an aversion to smells, he suggested she have a blood test, just to be sure. He jotted down some notes on her chart, and Serafina felt a flutter of anxiety in her stomach. The doctor reassured her that the test results would take a few days, but she could rest easy for now. When she left the clinic, a wave of uncertainty followed her, along with the nagging fear that something was wrong, but she tried to push it aside. 3 days later, the phone rang, interrupting Serafina as she folded laundry in the living room. She picked it up, and an unfamiliar voice introduced herself as the receptionist from the clinic. "Can you come in to discuss the results of your test?" she asked. Serafina's heart raced. Why did they want to see her in person? Her mind filled with dread as she wondered what was going on. Her aunt insisted on accompanying her to the clinic, despite still being weak. Serafina tried to persuade her to stay home, but her aunt was firm. Together, they took a taxi to the clinic, where they were led into an office by the same doctor who had examined Serafina. The doctor smiled warmly, but his expression soon turned serious. "Serafina," he began, "you're pregnant." The words hit her like a thunderclap, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. Her aunt reached out to take her hand, offering silent support as the doctor continued. "It's early, but we've run additional tests, and the ultrasound shows that you're carrying triplets." Serafina's eyes widened and her breath caught in her throat. "Triplets?" she whispered, stunned. The doctor nodded gently. Yes, we're very certain. This is a high-risk pregnancy, so we'll need to monitor you and the babies closely. You'll need regular checkups. Everything around Serafina seemed to blur. She was barely able to comprehend what he was saying. Triplets. It felt like a dream, one that she wasn't ready for. At the same time, a wave of emotions crashed over her: fear, awe, joy, panic, all mixed together in a whirlwind of feelings. As they left the clinic, her aunt smiled through her tears. "I'm so happy for you, but triplets?" she said with a soft laugh. "That's a lot to handle." Serafina smiled weakly, but her mind was in turmoil. "I don't even have a stable income right now," she said softly. "And Thaddeus." Her voice trailed off, the lump in her throat growing. Her aunt gave her a knowing look, understanding what she meant. There was no father in the picture to help her, and Thaddeus, the man she had hoped to rely on, had disappeared without a trace. Once home, Serafina locked herself in her room, overwhelmed by the news. She thought back to the time she had spent with Thaddeus, their brief but meaningful connection. Now it all seemed like a fleeting dream. She kept trying his number, hoping it would go through, but it always ended with a voicemail. She wondered if he had given her the wrong number or if he was avoiding her on purpose. With tears streaming down her face, she placed her hands on her stomach. She wasn't ready for this, but the babies growing inside her were her responsibility now. She couldn't let fear take over. Her aunt, always the one to offer guidance, patted her shoulder and said firmly, "You have to find him, Serafina. He has a right to know, and you need help." Serafina knew her aunt was right, but despite trying everything, she couldn't reach him. She thought back to the conversation she had overheard on the plane, the mention of investors and business deals. There had to be something she could do. Perhaps the key was the airline Thaddeus had flown with. He traveled often, and maybe someone at the airport or within the airline could remember him. With renewed determination, Serafina decided to visit the airport where she had last seen Thaddeus. If no one there could help, maybe the airline's headquarters would. Serafina explained that she only knew Thaddeus's first name, but thought he was important at the airline, maybe an executive. She tried not to sound too frantic. The attendant's face showed a small sign of recognition, but he stayed professional. "I can't share details about our passengers," he said. "We have rules about privacy. If you can give me more details, I might be able to help." Serafina quickly told him about the turbulence on the flight and how Thaddeus helped calm a very upset passenger. She explained that he seemed well-liked by the airline staff. The attendant's eyes moved as if deciding what to say. He admitted that Thaddeus's name came up among some staff, but he couldn't share personal information. Still, when the other employee, a middle-aged woman, joined them, she smiled faintly and said, "Oh, Thaddeus. He's traveled with us a few times and is very friendly, but he's not an executive. I heard he's someone important, but I can't say much more." Serafina felt her heart race. "Can you tell me where he works?" she asked. "An office or a place in the city?" The woman hesitated and then whispered, "I've seen him meeting with airline reps a few times in a private lounge. I overheard them talking about the headquarters in the city center. Maybe he works there at a high level." Serafina thanked them and left the lounge feeling hopeful. She'd seen information about the airline's headquarters on their website, but she hadn't known Thaddeus could be so involved. She decided to go there next. She took a taxi to the downtown business district where tall, shiny buildings stood in the sun. When they stopped in front of a large skyscraper with the airline's logo on it, Serafina's heart sped up. She stepped out and stared at the tall glass building. Inside, everything was shiny and clean, and workers moved quickly around the room, swiping cards to pass through security gates. She went to the desk and told the receptionist she needed to speak with Thaddeus, but she didn't know his last name. The receptionist didn't help. "Sorry, miss, but only employees or people with appointments can enter," she said politely. Serafina asked again if she could check for Thaddeus among the upper management. The receptionist gave a tight smile and said, "Sorry, but I can't share that. Maybe try another way." Serafina felt her cheeks burn with frustration. "Can you check if there's a Thaddeus who frequently flies with us?" she asked. The receptionist gave a soft smile and said, "I'm afraid I can't give you any details, but maybe you can make an appointment another time." Serafina nodded, her heart sinking. She could feel her grip tightening on the ultrasound pictures in her folder. Part of her wanted to tell the receptionist everything about Thaddeus and the babies, but she felt it wasn't the right time. She stepped back and scanned the room for another way in. She noticed a set of elevators guarded by a security checkpoint. People flashed badges or swiped cards to pass. Serafina thought about trying to sneak through, but guards were stationed nearby. She decided to sit and pretend to check her phone, hoping Thaddeus would show up and notice her. Minutes turned to an hour, and her legs began to ache. Just as she was about to give up, she saw a man who looked just like Thaddeus stepping out of an elevator with two other men. Her heart jumped, but they were too far away. She tried to move toward him, but a crowd blocked her path. By the time she reached the corner, he had disappeared behind a door to a private meeting room. Serafina was stopped by a security guard who told her to stay back. She tried to explain, but the guard just told her to leave. She could hear some people talking about Thaddeus being important, even the head of the company. Feeling defeated, Serafina left the building and stepped out into the sunlight. The heat made her frustration feel even worse, but she wasn't going to give up. She had seen him. Thaddeus was real, and he was someone important, not just an ordinary businessman. Serafina promised herself she would find a way to reach him. She would not give up. She stood on the sidewalk, her fists clenched with determination. She would speak to him for the sake of her unborn children. Thaddeus's day had been packed with meetings, but he couldn't stop thinking about the strange feeling he had. It was like something was missing, and it kept nagging at him. His staff had told him about a woman named Serafina who had come to his office trying to speak with him. They said she was asking about him by his first name and didn't have an appointment. They thought she might be trying to blackmail him. Thaddeus didn't like that idea. He remembered her from the flight. She seemed so kind and worried about her aunt, not like someone trying to make trouble. In his meeting with the board of directors, Thaddeus tried to focus, but he couldn't stop thinking about Serafina. After the meeting, one of his advisors came to him and said, "We can have her banned from the building if she comes back. We can't risk any trouble." Thaddeus didn't want to do that. "Let me think about it," he said. The advisor left, and Thaddeus sank into a chair, feeling uneasy. He remembered how Serafina had acted on the flight, calm, even when everything was going wrong. He tapped his phone, seeing missed calls from clients and staff, and then saw a number he didn't recognize. He thought it might be from Serafina. Just then, the phone rang. He picked it up. "Hello?" he said cautiously. "Thaddeus?" came a nervous voice. It was Serafina. "It's Serafina from the flight. I've been trying to reach you, but the calls didn't go through. I didn't know if you were avoiding me." Thaddeus's heart raced. "Serafina," he said, his voice soft. "I wasn't avoiding you. I've just been very busy." Serafina took a deep breath. "I came to your office, but they wouldn't let me see you. I'm sorry if I caused any trouble." Thaddeus pinched the bridge of his nose. He was trying to stay calm. "I've heard about you," he said, his voice stiff. "It's just a lot to take in. What's going on?" Serafina took another deep breath. "There's something huge I need to tell you. It's bigger than you and me. I'm pregnant." Thaddeus froze. "Pregnant?" he repeated, stunned. "Are you sure?" Serafina's voice grew quieter. "Yes, I'm having triplets. I know it's unbelievable. I was shocked too, but I've seen doctors. I wouldn't make this up." Thaddeus felt like his world was spinning. He tried to speak but couldn't find the words. Finally he asked, "Are you sure?" Serafina nodded. Yes, I've seen doctors. I have the ultrasound results. Thaddeus rubbed his forehead. He had to think. This was a lot to take in. I just need to know the truth, he said slowly. Are you sure it's mine? Serafina's voice was strong but gentle. I'm carrying your children, Thaddeus. I've been trying to reach you for weeks. I'm terrified and alone. This changes everything for me and for them. Thaddeus stared out the window, his mind racing. Could this really be true? Was she telling the truth? He tried to stay calm, but his mind was filled with questions. Serafina's voice was firm but tired. You might not believe me, but I am carrying your children, and I have proof. He slowly breathed out as he listened to Serafina speak. Her words were coming fast, and he could feel the sadness in her voice, but he also understood that there was a risk someone might be trying to trick him. I need some time, Serafina. I can't just believe this without proof, he said. Serafina's voice shook as she replied, I don't have time to waste. I'm struggling with everything, money, my health, and my emotions. I need to know if you can help me. Thaddeus felt bad. No matter what, she was clearly going through a hard time. I'm not heartless, he whispered. Let me think about it. I'll talk to my team. Serafina looked upset. My problem is not a business issue, Thaddeus. Don't treat me like one, she said. Thaddeus apologized. I didn't mean it like that. I just need to be careful. There was a long silence. Then he spoke again. I think we should meet in person. We can go somewhere private and talk about it, and you can show me what you have. I want to understand it. Serafina sighed, relieved. Okay, let me know when. Before hanging up, Thaddeus said, It might take a few days. I have some important work to do, but I'll reach out soon. Serafina's voice was soft but firm when she replied, Please don't ignore me again. Thaddeus promised he wouldn't, and the call ended. He sat in the quiet boardroom, holding his phone. In just one conversation, his life had changed. He needed to make a decision, and he felt unsure of what to do. A few days later, Thaddeus chose a quiet, fancy restaurant for their meeting. He arrived early, slipping in through a side door. The restaurant was calm and elegant, with soft lights and quiet conversations. Thaddeus sat at a corner booth, tapping his fingers on a glass of water. He had made the reservation under a different name to keep anyone from noticing them. A few minutes later, Serafina walked in, guided by the waiter. She looked at him, and they both paused for a moment. They hadn't seen each other like this before. She gave a small smile and said, Hello, Thaddeus. Thaddeus stood up briefly. Serafina, he whispered. She looked tired, but there was a strong look on her face. Thaddeus felt guilty. He gestured for her to sit, and she sat down opposite him, folding her hands in her lap. A waiter came by with menus, but they both declined. Thaddeus spoke first. Thank you for coming. I'm sorry it took so long. There have been problems at work. Serafina looked up at him. I understand, she said, taking a deep breath, but I couldn't wait any longer. I need to show you something. From her bag, she took out an envelope and slowly pulled out a few ultrasound pictures. She placed them on the table. This is baby A, she said, pointing to one picture, and this is baby B and baby C. Thaddeus's eyes widened in surprise. There were 3 tiny babies in the pictures. Triplets, he whispered, remembering their conversation on the plane. Serafina nodded. I can't fake this. The doctors confirmed it, she said. Thaddeus stared at the pictures. He was amazed, but also scared. He picked up one of the pictures. I don't know what to say, he said quietly. I'm still working on something big with my company, and if anyone finds out about this, it could mess everything up. Serafina frowned. I know, but I can't do this alone, Thaddeus. I need help with all of this. Thaddeus gently set the pictures down. I should have contacted you sooner. I'm sorry, he said, but my company is on the line right now. My advisors are telling me to be careful. Serafina shook her head. You think I don't know about being careful? I'm the one carrying these babies, trying to pay for doctor visits and having no way to contact you. Thaddeus felt bad. I know, he said, "but my advisors." Before he could finish, a man in a suit walked up to their table. He had a name tag from Thaddeus's company, though it was turned away so no one could see it. Serafina recognized him from earlier at the office. The man looked at Serafina. "So this is the woman causing all the trouble at the office," he said with a smirk. "Thaddeus, you brought her here?" Serafina felt her anger rise. "Who are you?" she asked. "I'm an advisor," the man said, "and I've been working with Thaddeus for years. You're the one who's been making a scene in our offices. We don't need any more problems right now." Thaddeus's face turned red. "Enough," he said, his voice low. "I'm handling this." But the advisor didn't stop. "Do you know what's happening with the Middle Eastern investors? We can't afford any scandals." Serafina felt humiliated. She didn't want money. She just wanted Thaddeus to listen and believe her. "I don't want your money," she said, her voice shaking. "I came here to show Thaddeus the truth." The advisor didn't care. "We know what you're really after," he said with a sneer. Thaddeus didn't speak. He looked between Serafina and the advisor, unsure of what to do. The tension in the restaurant grew as more people stared at them. Serafina couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed the pictures from the table and stood up. "You want proof? Here it is," she said, pushing the pictures into Thaddeus's hands. "But don't do this for your company. Do it for these babies. They deserve better than this." Thaddeus looked at her, but his hesitation hurt her more than words could say. Without another word, she turned and left the restaurant. As she walked out, she heard Thaddeus call her name, but she didn't stop. Outside, the city lights blurred as she walked down the street, her chest aching. She was alone in this. The only thing on her mind was how Thaddeus had let her down. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp pain in her stomach. She stopped, clutching her belly. "What's happening to my babies?" she thought, her heart racing. She found herself at the hospital where nurses helped her inside. The pain wouldn't stop, and she was scared for her babies. The doctors did an ultrasound and confirmed that the babies were still safe, but Serafina needed to rest and avoid stress to keep them healthy. She felt relief, but also worried. How would she pay for the hospital bills? Her money was running out. She thought about Thaddeus again, how he had been hesitant to help her when she needed him most. He stood by the window, holding his phone to his ear. His face showed signs of stress. For the last 2 days, he had been very busy. He had to answer calls from investors, board members, and helpers who were all trying to make sure the big deal he was working on would go smoothly. But every now and then, his mind would go back to the moment at the restaurant when he saw Serafina looking sad and disappointed. He didn't defend her when he should have, and that made him feel guilty. He tried to forget about it by focusing on work, but it kept coming back to him. He wanted to call her, but he was too scared and proud to do it. His helpers had told him to be careful. Any trouble right now could ruin everything. He thought he was doing the right thing by not calling her because if he lost the deal, there wouldn't be any money to help her. But deep inside, he felt bad. He wondered if Serafina had planned that scene to make him feel guilty. But he knew, deep down, that her pain had been real. Later that afternoon, he walked into a big meeting room. It was in one of the tallest buildings in the city, and the windows gave a perfect view of the city. People from other countries sat around a large table, waiting for Thaddeus to talk. They were all serious, looking at him to finish the deal. Thaddeus spoke confidently and told them all about the business plans and how they could work together. But even while he was talking, his phone kept buzzing. He tried to ignore it, but when he looked at it, there were lots of missed calls. Then the phone rang again, this time showing a number from the hospital. His heart dropped. Something was wrong with Serafina. He didn't know what to do. If he left the meeting, the whole deal could fall apart. But if he stayed and ignored the call, he could miss something important. He decided he had to go. He stood up and apologized, saying there was an emergency. The room was full of shocked people, but Thaddeus didn't care. All he could think about was Serafina and what might have happened to her. At the hospital, Serafina was starting to feel a little better. The doctors had helped her with the pain, and she was going to have another checkup soon, but she was still worried about everything. She had bills to pay, her aunt was still sick, and she didn't know how she was going to manage it all on her own. She thought about moving to a cheaper place and finding a job where she didn't have to work so hard. But taking care of 3 babies by herself was scary. She also wondered if Thaddeus would want to help her after the way he acted at the restaurant. She felt hurt by him, but also missed him. The flight they had shared had brought them together in a way that felt special, and she wished that time had been a good start for them. Meanwhile, Thaddeus was speeding through the streets to the hospital. He kept checking his phone, seeing more missed calls and texts. The hospital told him there was something wrong with Serafina, and now he was even more worried. He couldn't think about the meeting anymore. All he cared about was getting to her as fast as he could. He ran into the hospital and asked where Serafina was. The nurse pointed him to the maternity ward, and he rushed there. When he reached the room, he found Serafina lying in bed with a lot of machines around her. She looked up when he entered, and for a moment he saw both hurt and relief in her eyes. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. "I'm managing," she said, but her voice was weak. She told him the doctor said she needed rest and should avoid stress. Thaddeus felt bad for not being there when she needed him, but he promised to be there from now on. He told her that he had left the important meeting just to be with her, even though it might cost him everything. The doctor came in and explained that Serafina was pregnant with triplets, and the pregnancy was high risk. She needed to be very careful and not get stressed out. Thaddeus promised to do whatever he could to help her. Once the doctor left, Thaddeus looked at Serafina with serious eyes. He explained that his business helpers had been trying to keep them apart. They had used her pregnancy to make it look like he couldn't lead the company. He was angry when he found out, but now he was ready to fix things. Serafina was surprised and sad that people would treat her like that, but she was also relieved to hear Thaddeus say he would stand up to them. "I want to be here for you," Thaddeus said. "I'll protect you and our children, no matter what." Serafina was still a little unsure, but she could see that he meant it. She was scared about raising the babies alone, but maybe, just maybe, they could work things out together. The next day, Serafina was allowed to leave the hospital. Thaddeus took care of all the paperwork and promised to pay for her medical bills, even though she was proud and didn't want to take his help. She knew she needed it, though, and accepted. When they left the hospital, Thaddeus told her he wanted to show her something special. He drove her down a small road to a big open field with a private hangar where a jet was waiting. "This is where it all started," Thaddeus said. "I wanted to bring us back here, but this time it's different." Serafina was curious, but also nervous. As they got into the jet, she noticed the inside had been decorated like a celebration with flowers and soft lights. It looked like a place for a party, not a business flight. Thaddeus explained that he wanted to make up for everything, and he hoped this would remind them of the good times they had shared before. Serafina felt a little nervous as the airplane's engines roared. She put her hand on the armrest, remembering how bumpy her last flight had been. But then Thaddeus sat next to her and leaned in close. "I've got you," he said. His warm voice made her feel better. The plane lifted into the sky smoothly and sunlight filled the cabin. True to Thaddeus's promise, there were no sudden bumps or wind. Instead, the airplane felt calm and soft music played quietly in the background. Serafina relaxed and breathed out, not realizing how tense she had been. Once the plane leveled off, Thaddeus stood up and asked her to follow him. He led her to the front of the cabin, where a few people were waiting. Some of them were staff, and others were dressed in nice clothes. To Serafina's surprise, her aunt was sitting in a wheelchair. She had a nurse with her for the trip. "Auntie?" Serafina gasped, her heart racing. She quickly walked over to her aunt and hugged her. Her aunt laughed softly. "Thaddeus made sure I could come. My doctor said it was okay," she said. "I wouldn't miss this for anything." Serafina looked at Thaddeus with wide eyes. "You did this? But Auntie's still recovering." Thaddeus smiled and nodded. "I made sure everything was safe for her to travel. She said she'd do anything to see you happy." Tears filled Serafina's eyes, and she put her hand over her mouth, feeling overwhelmed. Then her attention turned to a beautiful arrangement of white flowers set up near the cockpit. There were some chairs in front of it, like they were going to have a ceremony. Serafina's heart began to race as she realized what Thaddeus had planned. He led her in front of the flower arch where some guests were sitting. Thaddeus gently took her hands in his. He cleared his throat, looking into her eyes. "I know we've had some rough times," he said. "We've had misunderstandings and challenges, but I'm sure of one thing. I want to stand by you, protect you, and share all the adventures we have, especially the ones with the 3 little lives we're bringing into the world." Serafina's breath caught in her throat. She felt the babies move inside her, like they were echoing her emotions. "Thaddeus," she whispered, feeling a tear fall. "I always dreamed of love and security, but I never imagined it would come like this. The babies changed everything, but you've changed too, haven't you?" Thaddeus nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "I have. I was so focused on business that I forgot what really matters, but you reminded me." A woman in a simple navy dress who seemed to be a close friend of Thaddeus's stepped forward with a small book. She introduced herself and said she was allowed to marry people in the air under special rules. Serafina was shocked but also amazed. Thaddeus turned back to her and asked, "Will you marry me, Serafina?" He pulled out a simple but beautiful ring, right here above the clouds where our story began. Serafina felt her heart fill with love, calm, and relief. She nodded, a tearful laugh escaping her. "Yes," she said, her voice shaking, "a million times yes." The small group around them cheered quietly, and Thaddeus gently slipped the ring onto Serafina's finger. They made their vows, promising to trust and support each other. Serafina's aunt smiled, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. The woman who married them said a few words, and then the ceremony was over. Thaddeus hugged Serafina carefully, mindful of her pregnancy. She felt safe and loved in his arms. For a moment they stood close, their foreheads almost touching, knowing that despite all the struggles, they had chosen each other. That was the most important thing. When they sat back down, the flight attendants handed out sparkling cider instead of champagne. Glasses clinked and everyone wished them well. The pilot even congratulated them over the speaker. Serafina's aunt jokingly said she couldn't wait to hold all 3 babies when they were born. Thaddeus laughed, joking about the babies earning frequent flyer miles. As they flew on, Thaddeus talked about how he had exposed the people who had tried to hurt Serafina and his company. He promised the world would know that Serafina wasn't just anyone. She was his wife, the mother of his children, and the woman he loved. Some of the staff quietly wiped away tears, touched by his words. The airplane soared higher, and Serafina felt a soft flutter in her belly. It was like the triplets were celebrating the joy in the air. She took Thaddeus's hand and placed it on her belly. He smiled in wonder when he felt the movement. They sat together, looking out at the sky, feeling peaceful and happy. Thaddeus no longer thought about business or betrayal. Serafina felt calm inside, sure that their future was full of love. The airplane flew on, passing clouds like silent protectors of their secret promise. Serafina whispered to Thaddeus, "No turbulence can ever break a love that was meant to soar." She closed her eyes for a moment, savoring the warmth of Thaddeus's arm around her. Outside, the sun was rising. and everything felt new and full of hope. When she opened her eyes, she smiled at Thaddeus. They were both ready for whatever life had in store, knowing that their love would carry them through. The world below felt small, and the future felt limitless. Thanks for watching. If you like the story, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Check out our other videos too. See you in the next one.